Tell me about a time that you solved a pain point for customers. Hey everyone, we're here today with Amit to do a product management mock interview. Before we get into the mock interview, Amit, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, for having me here. I'm a second year student, MBA student at MIT Sloan right now. Prior to Sloan, I worked, most of my experience has been working with early stage and tech startups in India, where I transitioned to product management. And after my MBA, I'm heading to Amazon as a technical product manager.
Awesome, thanks. And today in this mock interview question, we'll be doing a interview question that's sort of similar to the Amazon, more behavioral focused type interview questions. So in today's question, what I'd like to ask you, Amit, is tell me about a time that you solved a pain point for customers.
So just to give you some context, my first job was with a startup called Chai Point in India. This was a chain of tea retail stores, similar to kind of what Starbucks is here. We were trying to do it with chai in India. And I was leading marketing there. And as part of marketing, one of the goals that I had for that quarter, or one of my important goals, was to launch a mobile-based loyalty program. And in order to do that, I wanted to understand what are the kind of features we would build. So I was doing some user research. In order to do some user research, I was visiting stores. I was talking to customers in stores. And one of the things that I identified was that while a lot of customers felt that a loyalty program would be good, I realized that there were some much deeper and bigger pain points they were having with the core experience, their experience in the store itself. And that was that the queues at the store were just huge, especially during rush hours. And so that's the problem I identified. And here's what I did about it. The first thing that I did was really try to understand what was happening. Was it an operational issue? Was it like a training issue? So observing what was happening, talking to a few customers, and just being at the store, I realized the big pain point was payments. There was a lot, payments were taking a lot of time. Just to give you a sense, the average ticket size was like 50 cents in US terms. So we didn't have credit card or debit cards at that time. And most of the people were paying using currency. And at that time, digital payments were not popular. And there was a big problem of tendering change at that time. So that was creating a lot of chaos at the counter. And really, we were aware that something like this was happening. I didn't know how bad experience this was leading to. With that insight, I kind of went back to my team and I discussed that, you see, this is the problem. This I feel is like a much bigger pain point. And is there something we can do with the loyalty program? Can we try to address it? And one of the team members at that time proposed, how about launching a digital wallet? How about where customers can come and pay using QR codes? And at that time, just to give you an idea, this right now, it's pretty common payment using QR codes. At that time, it was a completely novel concept. No one in India at that time was doing it. But I did more research around it and talking to my team and doing some understanding from the engineers, how feasible it is. I realized we can develop something like this, something of in a basic format. And it would have been very hard to develop a few years before, but now it's more easy to develop. So got an understanding that this is something that could be done. And next I went to some more senior stakeholders in the company. I was reporting to the CEO and they were the CEO, everyone involved. And I proposed to them, look, this is a much more serious pain point. And after talking to my team, I realized that we can actually, rather than launching a loyalty program, we can actually build a payments app where customers can load money onto their wallets, digital wallet, and pay much more quickly and efficiently. So yes, there was some reluctance on their part. It was not easy to persuade everyone at that time, but I aligned slowly. I worked through their whatever their concerns were, and I was able to align them. And the result was that I was able to convince them to launch a pilot in one single store. So for 2 months, we built a very basic MVP, if you can say, and launched it in just one store. We were tracking a couple of metrics, like how many people downloaded the app and how much it reduced the average transaction time. The result of the pilot was after about 6 weeks that we got about 1,000 downloads at that store. For the pilot, it exceeded what we were expecting. And the wait time came from 40 seconds to 20 seconds, on average. And then we rolled this app across all the stores over the next 6 months. And within a year, 25% of all the company's revenues were coming through this program. So Not only this helped solve a big customer pain point, it helped shape the whole direction and digital strategy for the company for the many years to come. So this is a story that I wanted to share, and happy to go into any of the elements that you want to discuss about.
Totally. Well, thanks for sharing that story. Really fascinating, different take on a type of story in general, and sounds like it had a really big impact on the team, which is awesome.
Thanks.
Um,
Yeah.
so I guess like you mentioned convincing stakeholders. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into that. Like, how did you go about persuading people that the idea that you had was the right one for the product and for the team?
Sure. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty. Even I was not sure that this was the right idea and it was something that would work. Uh, I would say, like, at that time, the stakeholders, like, everyone was aligned that this was an important problem. They also, to their credit, felt very excited that, this is something that's new and they wanted to test out something new. The genuine concern was, at that time, there were two concerns. One was like, will people actually use it? There was no precedent. Like, no one was using QR codes at that time for payment. And like, we were not a big chain, we were like a small startup doing something. So will people really use it? That was their concern. And the other big concern, which was, I think, a much bigger and real concern, was that all these solutions had to be integrated with POS, the point of system, the billing machines in the stores. And these are really bulky, heavy software. Like, I remember their downtime was 30%. 30% of the time the machines would never be talking back to us. It was down. Like, so the concern was like, if this doesn't work, this might actually end up creating even worse experience for customers. So these were all really important points. And the way I thought about, like, the way I resolved those concerns was, first, like, in terms of thinking, like, how do we get people to use it? I propose, like, I don't know the answer to that, but what we can do is actually launch a small pilot. We'll not know until we do that. So we can do a very, very low cost pilot. I've talked to my team, and like, the app should not take more than about 6 to 8 weeks to build out the simpler version. And we can make it really low risk. So we can just roll it out to 1 to 2 stores. They felt like this seemed like the right strategy. So I was able to get people on board about this. The second one, it took me a lot more. I had to do a lot more homework on the second one, to solving the complex technology piece. I had to talk to the POS providers. I had to understand, like, I had to actually convince some other people in finance to upgrade the POS infrastructure at store. So we bought better machines, we installed better Wi-Fi, we installed better software. So there was some cost involved in doing so, but because everything was just at a small scale, at a pilot scale, people were not really concerned about, like, shelling out a lot of money. So
Got it. So the pilot sort of helped you be the canary in the coal mine to figure out whether or not this is going to work, and then you scaled it up.
Sure.
I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more about. So you ran this pilot. Were the metrics really good when you ran it? Is that sort of what was convincing after that?
Yeah. So we were tracking two metrics, as I was saying, like number of people who download the app, to give a sense of, are people willing to use the solution? Do they think that this is something that will be helpful for them? And second was, like, how much it reduced the average transaction time, how much it reduced the actual problem of waiting, of payments. So was the solution really working at all? And the way it happened, the way it evolved over those 6 to 8 weeks, was that there was a very strong high adoption. Like, this was a good enough problem, and we were able to come up with right messaging, that there was a lot of downloads. But I think it took us some trial and error to get the average transaction time to get down from 40 seconds to 20 seconds for people who were transacting. There were some difficulties we faced, but we solved them through iterations.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what those challenges were and how you solved them?
Sure. So some of the simple challenges were, like, this was 2015, I guess, or 14. I don't exactly remember. So it was some time back. And one of the challenges was, like, we didn't anticipate. So this needed internet connectivity on users' mobile phone to work. And there were some people were working using 2G at that time. Like, and so those were some of the things that I didn't anticipate. Like, and because of those lags, it was taking a long time. And so one of the things that we had to do was, like, as a temporary solution, install Wi-Fi devices at stores. But also there were, like, a lot of minor UX issues. Like, it was very, the onboarding experience was really cumbersome. There was so much friction, like for people to load money, for people to like create accounts. So we simplified all of that. And that took a lot of iterations, like doing those minor changes was something that we fixed over that course of that time.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm also just curious. You mentioned the metrics that you evaluated. Like, what sort of like? Can you tell me about the role of metrics in launching this product, and maybe some metrics that weren't as useful that you thought were going to be useful, and why you picked the metrics that you picked?
Sure. So I think we picked like a bunch of metrics to pick. To answer your first question, why we use metrics was, I was very clear going into this that this is an experiment. That's how I convinced everyone that, see, this is going to be an experiment. And when you run an experiment, you need to either, at the end of the experiment, you need to tell that, you were able to prove or disprove your hypothesis. So metrics played an extremely important role. And we said like, okay, we are going to look at these 3 or 4 metrics. And we are going to say that if we get more than 500 downloads, that means the solution is working. So that was exact. And we defined a metric and we defined certain threshold. And those thresholds were like, I didn't build like huge data models to come up with what those thresholds were, but it's based on some quick estimation, like how much traffic we were getting. We said like, okay, based on the traffic that we were getting, if 10% of people would download the app, that's good enough for us. So that's how we kind of defined the metrics and their thresholds. Some of the other metrics that I was also tracking, I wanted to track was around how frequently people would be using the app once they downloaded it, what the ticket size on those metrics would be, how much are they spending, like what's the revenue that we would be getting. So I think those were useful metrics to track just to keep an eye on. But in terms of proving this hypothesis wrong or right, those were not as useful as the first one that I talked about.
Got it. That makes sense. So I guess maybe just a tangential question I have for you, Amit, is if you were to redo this experience, like what have you learned and what would you do differently from how you launched that?
Yeah. I think I'll just say something that I feel, I'll start with something that I feel we did well overall. I think was just to kind of show we didn't waste a lot of time in terms of designing, experiment, or like thinking a lot about it. We launched it quickly and we got it off. I think having that bias for action was extremely important, and that helped kickstart this program. Having said that, I feel like I could have done a little bit more research around thinking about all the edge cases, like things that can go wrong. So for example, one of the things that I had not anticipated about were potential security concern or like fraud scenarios that could come up. Once this experiment started, what we started seeing was that because people were loading money on their digital wallets and then using QR codes, some customers started taking screenshots of their QR code and started circulating it. And I had not at all anticipated that. And that led to some fraud cases, that led to some difficulties in accounts reconciliation at the back end. And so going ahead, I would still like to operate at that pace, but at the same time, think about certain edge cases, think more exhaustively around like what can go wrong. Even if I don't intend to like take action or build a solution for them in the first version, I'd just like to keep that in mind and keep everyone informed about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's hard to catch all those things, but it does sound like an insight there is just learning that you can anticipate some of the challenges earlier on, as opposed to finding out last minute. Awesome. Well, I do want to start to get towards the feedback section, but if there are other points or interesting areas of this story that you'd like to share, would love to hear any other aspects of it before we have like a couple minutes before we move on to the feedback part.
I think we covered most of it. I think this is one small thing which I feel like helped me align stakeholders more closely, and it's to do something with the understanding the human element, behind what goes on building these kind of products. So one of the things that I knew was the CEO who had the loudest voice amongst everyone. He was a big fan of Starbucks. And what I knew about, and when I was doing my research, is Starbucks had launched something like this. And knowing that, if I presented that story to the CEO, he would be persuaded a lot to kind of develop it and like back this. So understanding what motivates each of those individual stakeholders help you kind of move the product vision ahead. And that's a lesson that I've carried on even in later products that I have worked on.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Was there something specific that you did that you want to share about knowing the intent of the stakeholder that you positioned really
Yeah.
well?
So he loves Starbucks. He talks about Starbucks all the time. And one of the things that I did was actually talk to him about, like, just share some data around what are some of the metrics around this program was, around Starbucks loyalty program was, how many users it has, what are the features it was using. And I think that that kind of convinced him that this is a similar direction we should also follow. So just sharing that data was like kind of pushed him a little bit in that direction.
Got it. Totally makes sense. All right, awesome interview, Amit. We can take a deep breath and sort of transition now from the interview stage into sort of just talking about the interview and talking about how it was for you and maybe any tips and things like that. So before I jump into some of the notes that I wrote down about what made this interview really, really awesome, I would love to hear just a little bit of your self-reflection. What do you think went well? What would you change within this interview?
Yeah, sure. I think what went well, why I generally like this story, is that not only it's like a very relevant story in a product management interview, it's also, especially for Amazon, it kind of highlights multiple of their leadership principles like customer obsession, ownership, bias for action, earning trust. So I generally like to, so one thing to keep in mind is like try to pick stories which can highlight multiple of these leadership principles. What I find generally challenging is that while I lived through this experience, so it was very clear and vivid in my mind. It's always a challenge to balance like being concise versus making sure you are describing everything in detail. So that's something that I find challenging, and maybe you can give more feedback on like how I did there, or what are the areas of improvement on that front.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah, totally great points. And I did think one of the most effective parts of this interview is how clearly it demonstrated some of those principles. And you didn't really have to explicitly call them out. Like, it's not like, oh, this is the thing. But you clearly had done your research and thought about it and thought about this example as it relates to those values. And so you were able to bring that into your interview really effectively. So just some notes that I wrote down on what I thought really went well. So I thought you did a great job setting context. So sometimes interviewees will jump in really quickly into problems without providing necessary context. And so there were a couple times you caught yourself even, you were like, oh, the POS is like POS. Oh, by the way, point of sale, to make sure that people understood where you're coming from, because not all interviewers will know the exact context. And I thought that was like particularly effective because you're talking about an example in India where, as a person who's living in America right now, like I don't know what the state would be like. Totally. I don't know how the QR code ecosystem is. And so it helped to exemplify the aspects of your accomplishments that were really, really remarkable. I thought that was an excellent job with context setting throughout the interview. I think that overall you had a really conversational and friendly tone. And that was really helpful. Like, it put me at ease. I felt like we were talking, brainstorming, kind of just talking about a product. It wasn't so stiff. You were very like casual, but at the same time, it was clear that you had really had expertise and you could easily answer questions. You could dive into any topic that I threw at you. So I think that almost is the exact sweet spot of how you want to come in these interviews. Is you want to come in with a casual, sort of friendly attitude, comfortable attitude, while also being very confident and being able to speak to anything that comes up. I would say that and I think this maybe could help to the point that you're saying about like how much to talk. I think a little bit of like structure around the experience might have helped a little bit. So you could introduce it very late on, but it's like, oh yeah, phase 1 was the pilot, phase 2 was this thing, and then phase 3 was analyzing the results or something. Or breaking it down into components, because that just helps me as an interviewer know where to dive into a little bit more, And then you can it's actually a smart tactic on your part as an interviewee to break it down like that, because then sort of how I'm thinking about it as an interviewer, and I'll probably dive into those specific topics. I thought overall I wasn't lost at all in your interview, but providing a little bit more of the structure around it could help guide the interviewer, which helps guide your answers.
Sure. Great. That's a great feedback. And I think this is something to do with like what you were trying to do and how it came across. In my mind, I was trying to do it phase-wise, but maybe explicitly calling it out that first I did this and second phase was this and third phase, I think totally makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny how like something as simple as a name to
Yeah.
that thing, like phase one, actually provides a
Yeah.
ton of logistical clarity.
Absolutely.
And I sort of got that you were doing that. That's why I'm giving you this piece of
Sure.
feedback,
No,
basically. But
absolutely.
it's like, oh yeah, just like make it a little more explicit and just call it out
Right.
a little bit.
Right.
And
Agreed.
I think it could be really awesome. And yeah, I mean, I think overall, this is like your personal experience. It's clear you had a lot of. I thought your discussion on metrics was really thoughtful, and so I thought you really aced this interview overall. So it's clear why you got a job at Amazon because you're really excellent at
Sure.
some of these interviews.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Great.
Well, any thoughts or reactions to anything that I just said, or any other additional tips, things that you want to share with folks watching this video?
Sure. So I think I'll just share a couple of tips for generally preparing for Amazon product interviews. Um, I don't know how Amazon product interviews are for everyone, but especially for MBA grads and Amazon recruit a lot of MBA PMs. The most of the focus, about 75 to 80% of the focus is on these kind of stories. So out of the 4 interviews I had, 3 were like just stories and 1 was like standard product interview. Uh, and the really what helped me prepare well for these interviews were 2 things. So one, tactical things. When you are preparing your stories, try to prepare in the standard star format, situation 1 2 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then results. And when you are trying to say results, uh, do it in a very concrete data driven way, like speak out data. Don't just say like I improved sales, but say I improved sales by 20% over this period of time. So having that star format and being very concise in each part is very explicit in each part is important. The other thing is that it's very important to be very thoughtful about your stories and make sure every story ties back to 1 or 2 or more leadership principles, and understanding what the leadership principles really mean. Like for example, customer obsessions in terms of Amazon means not just talking to customers or identifying their pain points, but even more importantly, identifying those needs which customers are not even talking about. Going, how do you dive deeper into that? So thinking about your stories, thinking about your experience, and like thinking how you would tie those specific experiences to your stories. So I think those things generally help me prepare for Amazon interviews. And finally, just doing few mocks, like specifically with people who had either cracked Amazon interviews or people who work at Amazon. I think that gives you a lot of good perspectives.
Totally. Great advice, Amit. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think it's definitely almost a different beast of an interview sometimes, the Amazon
Yeah,
interview, which
yeah.
is challenging for people. Um, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amit, for taking the time to be on the show. It's been awesome having you contribute and help other people in the Exponent community. And good luck to those people who are watching on your upcoming interviews.